The Supreme Court chamber was silent, so silent that one could hear the faint rustle of robes as Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on Representative Jasmine Crockett. The marble pillars loomed behind him, an austere reminder of the gravity of the institution. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Journalists, clerks, and spectators had gathered to witness what was expected to be a routine session of oral arguments in Johnson v. Texas Election Commission. But this morning, something extraordinary was unfolding. For nearly an hour, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had been presenting her argument against Texas's new voter identification requirements. She stood at the lectern, poised but resolute, her voice even and deliberate as she explained how the law, though written in neutral language, had produced severe disparities in access for minority voters. Her presentation was precise, her tone respectful, yet the tension in the air was unmistakable. Then Justice Thomas spoke. It wasn't unusual for him to remain quiet during arguments. For decades, he'd been known as the silent justice. But when he did speak, his words carried the weight of a hammer. This time, his voice cut through the chamber like steel on stone. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone sharp, "there is nothing in the original understanding of the Equal Protection Clause that would remotely suggest it applies to the specific ID requirements you're challenging." He paused, allowing the words to hang in the stillness. "The framers of the 14th Amendment," Thomas continued, "would find your reading completely foreign to their intent. States have broad authority to determine their own election procedures. What constitutional principle, exactly, do you believe invalidates requirements that apply equally to all citizens, regardless of race?" A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Thomas had just framed the argument in classic originalist terms, anchoring his reasoning in the supposed intent of those who drafted the amendment more than 150 years earlier. It was a powerful strategy, one that had carried the conservative majority through countless voting rights cases before. Crockett listened without interruption. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of intensity. She waited for the justice to finish, then drew a slow breath. Around her, the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Most advocates would have responded with citations, dozens of cases, perhaps, or dense historical analysis. That was how the Supreme Court usually worked, arguments stacked upon precedent, precedent stacked upon principle. But Jasmine Crockett was not a typical advocate. When she finally spoke, her tone was quiet, almost conversational, but her words carried a force that none in the room could have predicted. "Justice Thomas," she began, "in your memoir, My Grandfather's Son, you describe how your grandfather, a man born in 1896 to parents who lived under slavery, was prevented from voting despite poll taxes and literacy tests being applied equally to all citizens, regardless of race." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Given that experience," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "I must respectfully ask, if the 14th Amendment doesn't protect against facially neutral voting requirements that produce demonstrably disparate impacts based on race, then what constitutional principle protected your grandfather's right to vote?" For a moment, the entire chamber froze. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Crockett's question had shifted the terrain entirely. She had taken Thomas's own words, his invocation of neutrality, his reverence for original understanding, and turned them inward, grounding them in lived American experience. In the space of a single sentence, she had forced the court, and perhaps the justice himself, to confront the distance between abstract constitutional theory and the reality of racial discrimination. Justice Thomas blinked. His lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came at first. The normally unflappable jurist seemed momentarily unmoored. His usual impassive mask slipped, revealing, if only for a second, something like surprise. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "That's not relevant to the constitutional question before us," he said. "My personal background doesn't determine." He stopped, the sentence faltering midair. And then, from the other side of the bench, another voice broke the silence. "Actually," said Justice Sonia Sotomayor, "I think it's precisely relevant." A ripple of reaction swept through the spectators. Sotomayor's tone was measured but firm. Congresswoman Crockett is highlighting that facially neutral voting requirements have historically been used to produce racially discriminatory effects, something reflected even in your own family history, Justice Thomas, and recognized in this court's precedents from Anderson through Brnovich. Before Thomas could respond, Justice Elena Kagan leaned forward slightly, her voice following close behind. "I'd like to build on that point," she said. "If the 14th Amendment doesn't protect against seemingly neutral provisions that effectively deny ballot access based on race, what constitutional principle would have protected against the restrictions your grandfather faced? Those restrictions were also drafted to appear race-neutral while producing discriminatory results." Two justices, both referencing Thomas's family history, openly engaging with Crockett's question. It was unprecedented. The courtroom, usually an arena of measured legal exchange, now felt like a space where the human weight of history had intruded, inescapable, undeniable. Even Chief Justice John Roberts shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his notes as if searching for a procedural escape hatch. For those watching from the gallery, the moment was electric. Journalists scribbled furiously. Law clerks exchanged incredulous glances. One veteran court observer later described it as the most human moment the Supreme Court has seen in a decade. Crockett didn't move. She stood steady, her hands lightly resting on the lectern. There was no triumph in her expression, only clarity, the quiet conviction of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. For the first time in years, Clarence Thomas had been publicly confronted not by an ideological adversary, but by his own past, by the story he himself had told about the man who raised him. In that marble hall, the theory of colorblind constitutionalism met the reality of Jim Crow. And for a few breathless seconds, the theory blinked first. The Chief Justice finally cleared his throat. "Let's," he said carefully, "return to the specific provisions at issue in this case, the voter ID requirements, and whether the statistical disparities presented in the record rise to the level of constitutional concern." But the shift had already happened. Thomas's next questions, when they came 15 minutes later, sounded different. Less categorical, less dismissive. There was a trace of hesitation, perhaps even reflection. He no longer asked whether disparate impact mattered. He asked how courts might measure it. The echo of Crockett's question lingered, reverberating through the chamber long after the session ended. Reporters would later call it the question that stopped the court. And as the crowd filed out of the marble doors into the cold D.C. afternoon, the story of a freshman congresswoman who had silenced one of the Supreme Court's most powerful voices was already spreading across every news feed and social platform in the country. Long before the Supreme Court chamber fell silent, Jasmine Crockett had learned what silence could mean. As a young civil rights attorney in Texas, she'd stood in county courthouses where the air smelled faintly of paper and old varnish, watching elderly voters turned away for lacking the right kind of identification. She had seen the confusion in their faces, the quiet humiliation of being told their citizenship wasn't enough. She'd been there when a black veteran, a man who'd once driven supply convoys through Fallujah, was told that his expired driver's license, though accepted at the polls 2 years earlier, no longer qualified under the new law. Those moments stayed with her. Years before she ever entered Congress, Crockett had already been fighting the small, grinding battles of voter suppression. She knew that injustice didn't always shout. Sometimes, it came wrapped in the calm language of bureaucratic procedure. Her law office had been modest, 2 rooms above a barbecue joint in South Dallas, but her caseload was anything but small. Dozens of clients, many from rural counties, brought her stories that sounded eerily similar. A grandmother who'd voted for 50 years suddenly needed multiple forms of ID. A college student whose out-of-state license was rejected. A father told his signature didn't match the one on a decades-old registration card. Every case felt like a piece of something larger, something deliberate. She began to see the patterns, the disparate impacts masked by neutral wording, the hidden fences built out of policy rather than wood. It was here, in the steady rhythm of paperwork and testimony, that Crockett's understanding of the Constitution deepened. She stopped viewing it as an abstract parchment and began to see it as a living promise constantly tested by those in power. Her reputation grew quietly but steadily. Colleagues admired her blend of courtroom precision and moral clarity. Reporters began describing her as the lawyer who turned numbers into stories, someone who could translate statistical disparities into human consequence. By 2020, Texas was at the epicenter of national debates over election laws. When the state legislature passed one of the most restrictive voter ID measures in the country, Crockett became one of its loudest critics. She didn't just file lawsuits, she organized communities, appearing on local news and podcasts, explaining in plain language how facially neutral rules could function as tools of exclusion. Her advocacy didn't go unnoticed. When a congressional seat opened in her Dallas district, party leaders saw potential. But Crockett's decision to run wasn't strategic, it was personal. "I got tired of arguing against the same laws I could be helping to write differently," she later said. Her campaign was unapologetically direct. She didn't promise to fix Washington, she promised to fight for the people whose voices were being buried under paperwork and politics. She spoke at church basements, school gyms, and community centers. She told stories about the veteran, the grandmother, the student, all those faces that had passed through her small law office. And she won. Elected to Congress in 2022, Crockett entered Washington with the same relentless focus that had defined her legal career. She didn't climb slowly through party ranks, she sprinted. Within months, she was recognized as one of the chamber's most articulate voices on voting rights. Her speeches, delivered with precise diction and understated fire, regularly went viral online. But what many didn't see was the discipline behind the passion. Crockett's staff recalled that she began each morning reading case law. Her office walls were lined with annotated Supreme Court opinions. She studied not only the rulings but the reasoning, particularly that of Justice Clarence Thomas. That was no accident. She understood that to challenge the conservative legal framework dominating the court, she would need to master its language. The doctrines of originalism, textualism, and limited interpretation. She studied Thomas's concurrences, his dissents, even his public speeches. She read My Grandfather's Son cover to cover, noting the passages about his grandfather's struggles to vote. Privately, she wondered, how does a man whose family suffered from racially disguised voter restrictions come to see such restrictions as constitutionally permissible? That question lingered like an ember. By the time Johnson v. Texas Election Commission reached the Supreme Court, Crockett had already become a congressional authority on election law. The case centered on new ID requirements that mirrored many of the same issues she had litigated in Texas. Her deep familiarity made her a natural choice to join the legal team presenting the challenge. When the court extended an invitation for amicus argument, a rare privilege for a sitting member of Congress, Crockett didn't hesitate. Her preparation was exhaustive. For 6 weeks, she worked late into the night with her legal staff, rehearsing arguments under fluorescent lights. She pored over transcripts of oral arguments from similar cases: Shelby County v. Holder, Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee, dissecting the questions, predicting lines of attack. But she also practiced something less tangible: tone. Supreme Court advocates know that the courtroom isn't a debate stage. It's theater wrapped in ritual. Every word, every pause, carries weight. Crockett didn't want to sound defensive. She wanted to sound inevitable. Her mentor, a retired appellate judge, once told her, "In that chamber, confidence isn't volume, it's control of silence." She took that advice literally. When the morning of the hearing arrived, Crockett walked through the court's bronze doors dressed in a dark navy suit, her notes tucked neatly in a leather folio. She paused at the top of the marble staircase, looking up at the inscription carved into the arch: "Equal justice under law." She'd seen those words 1,000 times, but they hit differently that day. Inside, the air felt heavy with ceremony. Lawyers adjusted their ties. Reporters whispered into recorders. The buzz of conversation dipped into quiet as the justices entered. Crockett sat at the petitioner's table, heart steady, breath measured. She reminded herself that she wasn't just arguing a case, she was arguing a history. For 40 minutes, she built her case methodically. She began with statistics, numbers that told stories, reduced ballot access in minority communities, disproportionate ID rejections. Then she transitioned into precedent, cases where the court had recognized the constitutional significance of discriminatory effects, not just intent. And for most of that time, the justices listened. Then Clarence Thomas spoke. His questions came rapid-fire, confident, rehearsed. His voice carried that unmistakable edge of authority, the sound of a man certain of his intellectual footing. But as Crockett listened, she recognized something familiar. The very words he used, applied equally to all citizens regardless of race, were almost identical to the ones she had read in his own memoir describing the laws that had kept his grandfather from voting. A thought flashed through her mind like lightning. He doesn't see the mirror he's holding. She didn't plan the question then. It wasn't written in her notes. It rose, almost instinctively, from the years of quiet frustration, from the cases she had fought, from the history she had studied. So when the moment came, when Thomas pressed her again, dismissing her interpretation as foreign to the frammer's intent, she looked up, steady and unflinching, and asked the question that would echo through history. Justice Thomas, in your memoir, you described your grandfather, born in 1896, being denied the right to vote under laws that applied equally to all citizens. Given that, what constitutional principle protected his right to vote? In that instant, years of preparation met a single act of courage. She hadn't just challenged his argument, she had challenged the separation between doctrine and experience, between theory and the bloodlines of history. And when silence fell over the chamber, Jasmine Crockett understood she had done something rare in American law. She had turned a question into revelation. The moment the gavel struck signaling recess, the chamber seemed to exhale. For several seconds after Representative Jasmine Crockett asked her question, the air inside the Supreme Court had frozen, thick, electric, and unbreathing. Even the clerks, usually unflappable, sat wide-eyed behind their stacks of briefs. Clarence Thomas, the court's most guarded justice, had been stopped mid-sentence. His usual reserve had fractured, revealing something raw beneath the surface of decades of judicial certainty. As the justices rose to leave the bench, observers noticed that Thomas didn't immediately stand. His hands lingered on the edge of his notes, his gaze distant. Only when Chief Justice Roberts shifted did he move, gathering his papers slowly, deliberately. Crockett didn't look away. For a moment, 2 generations of Black American experience, the former sharecropper's grandson turned conservative icon, and the civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, faced each other across the courtroom. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the tension. All rise. The justices filed out through the crimson curtains, and murmurs filled the room like wind through dry leaves. Reporters scrambled for the exit, already drafting headlines in their heads. Law clerks whispered rapid assessments. Did she just call him out using his own memoir? She absolutely did. He froze. Outside, the steps of the Supreme Court were chaos. Cameras blinked under the gray D.C. sky. Correspondents spoke into microphones as if narrating history in real time. Within minutes, snippets of the exchange were racing across social media feeds. By the time Crockett exited the building, her phone was already vibrating non-stop. Texts, emails, missed calls, from journalists, colleagues, even rivals. Someone had already posted a short clip of the confrontation to X, formerly Twitter, captioned simply, "Jasmine Crockett silences Clarence Thomas with one question." Within an hour, it had 1 million views. Inside her car, Crockett stared out the window as they pulled away from the court. The Capitol dome loomed in the distance, half-shadowed by afternoon light. Her communications director, Lila Torres, sat beside her, typing furiously into a phone. CNN wants you live at 6. MSNBC at 7. NPR's requesting audio rights to the argument, Lila said. It's everywhere, Jasmine. That clip. People are calling it the most powerful Supreme Court moment in decades. Crockett didn't answer right away. She leaned her head back, eyes closed. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy realization of what she had just done. "Let's not make this about me," she finally murmured. "It's about the question." Lila looked up. "Yeah, but the question came from you." By evening, the footage was unavoidable. Every network carried it. The poised congresswoman at the lectern, the justice's startled expression, the long silence afterward. Analysts replayed the moment in slow motion, dissecting it from every angle. Legal scholars called it a masterclass in constitutional framing. Political commentators called it a generational confrontation. The hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Crockett versus Thomas. Hashtag the grandfather's vote. Hashtag 14th Amendment. In law schools across the country, professors were already preparing to discuss the exchange in their next class. "It's not about disrespect," said one constitutional law professor on PBS. "It's about the collision of biography and jurisprudence." Representative Crockett did what lawyers rarely dare. She reminded the court that its members are not separate from the history they interpret. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, reactions split along familiar lines. Progressives celebrated the moment as a moral reckoning. Representative Ayanna Pressley tweeted, "Crockett didn't just argue the law, she argued our history. And she did it with grace and brilliance." Conservative commentators saw something else entirely. A Fox News panel accused her of personalizing constitutional argument and undermining judicial decorum. A former clerk for Justice Thomas called it an ambush disguised as advocacy. But even among critics, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. It had landed. In the hours after the hearing, reporters clustered outside her office in the Rayburn building. Cameras lined the hallway, cords snaking across the marble floor. When Crockett finally appeared, still in the same navy suit, the noise surged, questions flying from every direction. "Congresswoman, did you mean to make it personal? Do you think you embarrassed a sitting justice? Was your question rehearsed?" She raised a hand gently, smiling just enough to calm the noise. "No one's embarrassed," she said. "We were discussing the Constitution. And I think the Constitution is always personal when it decides who gets to vote." The hallway fell quiet for a moment. Then flashes erupted again. That evening, commentators on both sides replayed her statement in full. It was impossible to ignore the subtext, the courage it took for a first-term congresswoman to challenge a 30-year justice on his own ground, in his own language. But while the media marveled at her poise, inside the legal community the focus was on the substance. Crockett's question had pierced a philosophical divide that had dominated the court for decades, between originalism and lived constitutionalism. Justice Thomas's argument, rooted in the original intent of the 14th Amendment's framers, treated history as something fixed and objective. Crockett's question treated it as something lived and ongoing, a story written in flesh and struggle. Late-night hosts turned the exchange into cultural shorthand. Memes appeared showing Crockett at the lectern with captions like, "When receipts meet rhetoric," and "History doesn't forget, justice." But in law offices and think tanks, the tone was more serious. Analysts debated whether the moment might influence the court's eventual opinion. "It's rare for oral argument to change a justice's mind," said Professor Daniel Wexler of Yale Law. "But moments like this, they can reshape how the reasoning is framed. Sometimes, even a single question becomes a thread in the written opinion." That night, alone in her apartment overlooking the Capitol, Crockett finally allowed herself to replay the moment. She watched as she asked the question, watched the brief flicker of emotion cross Thomas's face. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of history, of generations who had fought to be heard in rooms like that one. On the desk beside her sat a faded photograph of her grandmother, taken outside a polling station in the 1960s. She'd told Crockett once, "Baby, they'll change the rules before they change their minds. You just make sure you know the rules better than they do." Crockett smiled faintly at the memory. Maybe that's what she had done today. Across town, inside the Supreme Court building, clerks were still sorting through the transcripts. Chief Justice Roberts had requested a copy of the full audio immediately. Justice Kagan reportedly lingered in her chambers long after the others had left, quietly remarking to her clerk, "That was one of those moments people will study 50 years from now." As midnight rolled over the Capitol, headlines lit up across every major outlet. One question, one silence. Jasmine Crockett redefines Supreme Court discourse. Thomas stumbles in historic voting rights exchange. The day the court blinked, and beneath the noise of pundits and panels, something quieter began to stir. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the argument over how America defines equality had shifted, if only a little. For the first time in years, millions of Americans were talking about the 14th Amendment not as abstract text, but as a living protection written in their own family histories. The marble walls of the Supreme Court had heard countless arguments before, but rarely one that echoed so far beyond its doors. In the days that followed the hearing, Washington didn't move on, it revolved. By Tuesday morning, the marble steps of the Supreme Court had become a pilgrimage site for television crews. Reporters stood against the backdrop of its white columns, delivering live updates to millions of viewers who couldn't stop replaying the same 30 seconds of history. The networks called it the moment that broke the script. But while the public fixated on the spectacle, something quieter was happening in the country's law schools, think tanks, and editorial rooms. Everywhere, the same question echoed. Had Jasmine Crockett just forced the Supreme Court to look at itself? At Howard University, a constitutional law seminar devoted an entire class to the exchange. Professor Langston Royce projected the transcript onto the wall, his voice steady but electric as he pointed to Crockett's question. "This," he said, tapping the text on screen, "isn't just advocacy. This is jurisprudence reframed." She turned biography into constitutional argument. She made history the evidence. Students scribbled notes furiously. Some stared, inspired. Others just sat in silence, realizing they were witnessing something that would end up in casebooks. That same afternoon, the New York Times ran a front-page column titled, "The Day a Congresswoman Asked the Court to Remember." It was written by Pulitzer-winning historian Taylor Branch, who argued that Crockett had transformed oral argument into moral inquiry. What she did was not rhetorical theater, Branch wrote. It was restoration, placing human memory back inside the cold machinery of law. By midweek, even conservative publications acknowledged the magnitude of the moment. The National Review called it a reminder that legal reasoning is not immune to the contradictions of personal history, though it questioned whether such emotional appeals belonged in the courtroom. But for millions of Americans, emotion was the point. In classrooms, community centers, and churches, people began talking about the exchange like it was a sermon. They quoted her words, especially the last line, "What constitutional principle protected his right to vote?" For many, it wasn't a question meant for Thomas alone. It was for the country. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of the Supreme Court, the aftermath was far less public, but no less seismic. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was the first to reference the moment in internal conference, noting that Crockett's question distilled in 20 words what we've been circling for 20 years. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson reportedly nodded in quiet agreement. Even Chief Justice Roberts, though careful to remain neutral, conceded that the exchange reminded the court that judicial restraint is not judicial amnesia. Thomas, however, remained silent. According to staff close to the chambers, he spent the following days poring through his own past writings, his concurrences in Shelby County, Crawford, and Abbott versus Perez. Clerks noticed marginal notes in his handwriting, small, questioning annotations. One read simply, "Did we overcorrect?" He didn't speak publicly, but the silence said enough. Out in the wider world, political narratives were already forming. Progressives heralded Crockett as a constitutional truth-teller. Conservative lawmakers accused her of politicizing the judiciary. House Speaker Mike Johnson issued a statement calling her conduct borderline contemptuous of judicial decorum, while several members of the Judiciary Committee privately debated whether to censure her. But that debate only amplified her message. Every attempt to diminish her turned into another headline, another debate segment, another viral quote. One evening, during a CNN town hall on democracy, civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton summed it up succinctly. When a black woman stands in the Supreme Court and reminds a justice of the road his own grandfather walked, that's not disrespect. That's America talking to itself. Even former Justice Stephen Breyer, now retired, commented in an interview. It was extraordinary and necessary. Law must never forget that it serves people who bleed and breathe. In the weeks that followed, donations surged to voting rights organizations across the country. College debate teams reenacted the exchange as part of competitions. High school civics classes began lessons titled The Crockett Question. And in Washington, something even more remarkable happened. Lawmakers from both parties quietly introduced new legislation aimed at revisiting sections of the Voting Rights Act gutted in Shelby County versus Holder. The Grandfather's Vote Restoration Act, as it came to be called, cited recent testimony and public discourse highlighting the need to modernize protections for equal ballot access. Privately, Crockett didn't celebrate. She kept her focus where it had always been, on the work. Her staff described her office as a storm of calm determination. Reporters camped outside her door, but inside, she was reading. She combed through voting data from Georgia and North Carolina, preparing for the next committee session. When asked later why she hadn't done a media tour, she said simply, "I wasn't looking for applause. I was looking for an answer." But her silence only deepened the fascination. Profiles poured in, Time, The Atlantic, The Guardian, all painting her as the new face of moral courage in American politics. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. On The Daily Show, the host quipped, Clarence Thomas met the one question he couldn't answer without needing an original copy of his own diary. The joke drew laughs, but beneath it was truth. Because in the Supreme Court's chambers, history was stirring. When the decision in Johnson v. Texas Election Commission finally came down months later, the court ruled 5-4 in favor of striking down the restrictive ID law. The majority opinion, written by Justice Sotomayor, didn't cite Crockett by name, but it quoted the very principle she had voiced. Equal application of a discriminatory law does not erase its unequal burden. History reminds us that neutrality can be the most effective disguise for exclusion. Legal scholars immediately drew the connection. The opinion read like an echo of Crockett's words, expanded into doctrine. Justice Thomas, in dissent, acknowledged the historical resonance of the arguments, but his final paragraph carried an unexpected tone. Though I disagree with the majority, I recognize that the question of how history shapes equality is one every jurist must face, even when it challenges our own assumptions. For those who had watched the hearing months earlier, it was a quiet, almost humble concession, the closest thing to reflection he had ever placed in writing. When Jasmine Crockett read the opinion, she didn't gloat. She sat in her office overlooking Independence Avenue, the morning light spilling through the blinds, and whispered, "That's all I ever wanted, to make them look." Outside, the city moved as it always did. Sirens, traffic, distant chants from a rally near the mall. But somewhere in that noise, something had shifted. For once, the Constitution felt alive again. Not just a document to be cited, but a mirror to be held up to the nation's soul. And in that reflection stood a congresswoman from Dallas who had turned a courtroom question into a national reckoning. Months had passed since the decision, but the question still followed Jasmine Crockett wherever she went. At town halls, people quoted her words as if they were scripture. On news panels, pundits called it the line that rewrote the narrative. In classrooms, students debated whether a single question could really shift the arc of constitutional law. But in the quiet of her congressional office, the noise faded to something heavier, something closer to solitude. Stacks of mail lined her desk. Thousands of letters, many handwritten, some on folded notebook paper. They came from veterans, school teachers, college students, retired lawyers, pastors. Most began the same way. I saw what you did. One letter, written in shaky cursive, came from an 84-year-old woman in Alabama. When I was a girl, my mother walked me to vote. They made her read the Constitution aloud. She got every word right, and they still turned her away. I never thought I'd see someone say what needed saying in that court. Thank you, baby, for asking the question my mama never got to. Crockett read that one twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the top drawer of her desk. But not every letter carried praise. Some were angry, furious even. They accused her of humiliating a black man to please white liberals, of grandstanding, of destroying judicial respect. Anonymous messages slipped through email filters with subject lines that read like threats. One night, leaving a late committee session, she noticed a protest sign outside the Capitol steps that read, "Crockett, Congresswoman or courtroom radical?" Her security detail tightened after that. She stopped walking alone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fought her whole life for people's right to be seen and heard, and now her own voice had become both weapon and target. Still, she kept working. She chaired subcommittee hearings on voting access, introduced amendments to expand ballot protections, and continued to speak, carefully, powerfully, relentlessly, about what equality really means when tested by law. But fame, she learned, is a strange companion. It doesn't arrive with applause. It lingers with expectation. Every appearance became a test. Every speech drew scrutiny. The media wanted more moments, more sound bites, more confrontations. But Crockett had no interest in spectacle. The question was never about drama, she told The Atlantic. It was about truth, and truth doesn't need retakes. Behind the scenes, the political knives came out sharper. Speaker Mike Johnson filed a motion to remove her from the House Judiciary Committee, calling her a partisan disruptor who disrespected judicial integrity. The motion failed, barely, but it sent a clear message. She had unsettled the establishment on both sides. Even some of her allies urged restraint. Jasmine, one senior Democrat told her in a closed-door meeting, "We can't afford to make the courts a battlefield." She had smiled politely. "They already are," she replied. "I just stopped pretending they're neutral ground." That night, back in her apartment, she stood at her window overlooking the Capitol. The city shimmered in its usual contradictions, beauty and hypocrisy side by side. She thought about the justice she had challenged, about the silence that followed her question. Somewhere in that silence had been the sound of a nation realizing its reflection was imperfect. She wondered if he ever thought about it too. Across the Potomac, in a quiet Virginia home, Justice Thomas was said to have grown unusually introspective. His clerks reported that he'd begun rereading the writings of Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. He had even requested a copy of The Souls of Black Folk, a book he'd dismissed in interviews decades earlier. When asked later by a journalist whether the exchange with Crockett had affected him, Thomas said only, "Every question in that courtroom deserves an answer. Even the ones that come from memory." It wasn't an admission. But it wasn't denial, either. Meanwhile, the Johnson versus Texas ruling began reshaping lower court cases nationwide. Federal judges cited its language in striking down discriminatory ID provisions in Georgia, Alabama, and Missouri. Law professors began calling it the Crockett Doctrine, the idea that equality must be measured by impact, not just intent. In lectures, they showed her clips side by side with the opinion's final paragraph. One question, one principle, one turning point. But outside the legal halls, Crockett's life remained deeply human. She still called her grandmother every Sunday, still visited her old law office above the barbecue shop when she was back in Dallas. The owner downstairs would always grin and say, "You made us proud, counselor." She'd smile back, but she never stayed long. The past was a place she carried with her now, not one she needed to return to. The following spring, she gave the commencement address at Howard University. The auditorium was packed, students waving signs that read, "Ask the question." When she stepped up to the podium, the applause was thunderous. She waited for it to settle before speaking. "When I stood in that courtroom, I wasn't trying to win an argument," she said softly. "I was trying to make sure the law remembered who it was written for. You see, power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes, it hides in silence, and silence can be the most dangerous form of consent. So if you ever find yourself in a room where truth feels unwelcome, ask the question anyway. Because one question can turn a courtroom into a mirror." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed. Some students cried. Afterward, a young woman approached her, nervous, holding a law textbook against her chest. "Congresswoman," she said, "I watched that moment when I was 16. It made me want to go to law school." Crockett smiled gently. "Good," she said. "Now make sure you ask harder questions than I did." That night, as she packed her notes, she looked once more at the old photograph of her grandmother. The woman's face, proud and weathered, seemed to gaze right back. For the first time in months, Jasmine allowed herself to feel peace. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. Because she understood now that the power of that courtroom moment wasn't in silencing a justice. It was in awakening a conversation that had been asleep for too long. And as the lights of Washington shimmered through her window, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for fame or forgiveness, but for endurance. Because truth, she knew, doesn't win in a day. It wins by surviving the silence that follows.